She stopped every rider on that trail and asked for their old blankets. Word got around that the widow had gone strange. Dale Crandall said it first. But inside that cabin, she was building something no one in the territory had seen. Every scrap of wool, every yard of burlap, she had a system for all of it. Clara Hensley kneels inside her one-room cabin, pressing wool into the log wall, and her fingers disappear up to the second knuckle before they meet anything solid. That's how bad the gaps are. Daylight cuts through the west wall in thin, white lines, and when the wind picks up, which in central Montana is roughly every hour God sends, those lines whistle. Not a charming whistle, the kind that pulls heat out of a room like a syringe draws blood. The cabin sits on a shallow draw about 4 miles south of the Judith River, 160 acres of grass and grief deeded in her name after the Homestead Act paperwork cleared in 1883. 14 feet by 18 feet, 7-foot ceiling, 1 window on the south side, 1 door on the east. That's it. That's the whole structure. The logs are decent lodgepole pine, but the chinking between them, mud and dry grass, mixed wrong and applied in a hurry by a man who figured he'd fix it next spring, cracked its first winter. Gaps a finger wide opened along the west wall where the prevailing wind hits hardest. Some of those gaps you could slide a playing card through without bending a corner. James Hensley did not fix it next spring. He did not fix it any spring, because in February of 1885, a storm dropped the temperature to 29 below zero, and the cabin interior fell past freezing by midnight, even with the stove burning full. James went out to check on the horses sometime around 2 in the morning. Clara doesn't talk about what happened next. She has never described it to a neighbor, a preacher, or a friend. What she did instead, and this is the part that matters, is she started measuring. The rest of that winter, Clara recorded interior temperatures every 4 hours. She used a glass thermometer James had bought from a hardware catalog in Helena, hung it on a nail beside the stove, and wrote the numbers in a small, cloth-bound notebook with a pencil stub. Morning low, 11 degrees inside. 11. Inside a cabin with a fire. Evening high with the stove burning full and the door sealed, 38 degrees. That's a 27-degree swing in a single day, and the high never once touched comfortable. She calculated and wrote it down, because Clara Hensley does not guess when she can count, that the cabin was losing heat through the log walls faster than her stove could replace it. The mud and grass chinking was worthless. Cracked, shrunken, full of air channels that acted like little chimneys pulling warm air out and cold air in. Most people in that valley accepted this. Cold cabin, burn more wood, sleep in your coat. That was the answer. Had been the answer for decades. Clara looked at her notebook and saw a different answer. She saw a problem with numbers attached to it, and numbers can be changed. Spring of 1886, she starts asking every rider who passes along the trail for their worn-out blankets, old saddle pads, burlap sacks, anything wool or heavy fiber that nobody wanted anymore. She offers coffee, a hot meal if she has one, sometimes a dime. 10 cents for a blanket a man was going to throw in a ditch. Most riders take the deal and ride on thinking she's strange. Some feel sorry for her. A few tell the story at the saloon in Lewiston, and word gets around the way word always does in a valley with more cattle than people. The widow's lost her mind, hoarding rags, cutting them up with that little brass tool she carries. Now, if you've made it this far into Clara's story, stay with me, because understanding what she's actually doing changes everything about what comes next. She is not stuffing blankets into walls. She is engineering a layered insulation system, based on a principle most builders in 1886 don't understand, and won't for another 40 years. Still air is a better insulator than wood. Wool traps still air in its fibers, thousands of tiny pockets that resist heat transfer. But here's the catch, and Clara figured this out from her own freezing winter of measurements. Wet wool conducts heat instead of trapping it. Moisture is the enemy. So her plan isn't just wool in the walls. It's an inner wall surface, then a dead air gap, then a wool batting layer cut to measured widths, then a burlap vapor barrier to keep condensation from soaking the wool, then the outer log wall. 4 layers, each one doing a specific job. The narrator in me wants to tell you this is intuitive, but it isn't. Clara sat with her notebook for weeks working out why the cabin bled heat and what would stop it. Enter Dale Crandall, biggest operation in the valley, 1,200 head of cattle spread across 2 sections of land north of the Judith. Broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, 6'1", steel-gray hair swept back from a high forehead, brass pocket watch on a short chain catching the light from his left breast pocket. Military posture, chin lifted like he's posing for a daguerreotype he'll never sit still enough to take. Dale Crandall has survived every winter the Montana Territory has thrown at him by doing one thing: burning more wood. His answer to cold is volume. More fuel, more fire, more men to cut timber. It has worked for him because he can afford it. He runs the kind of ranch where money solves problems that thought could solve cheaper. He does not believe, does not even consider the possibility, that a widow with a brass-handled seam ripper and a pile of donated rags is going to outperform 30 years of his experience. She's not building anything, he tells his ranch hand as they ride past Clara's fence line one afternoon in late May. He watches her draping blankets over the split-rail fence to dry in the sun. Wool and burlap and old saddle pads arranged in neat rows. He shakes his head slow. The widow's lost her mind. That's not concern. That's dismissal from a man who's never had to solve a problem with 10 cents and a seam ripper. Clara watches him ride away. She pulls the brass-handled seam ripper from her canvas apron pocket, its handle catching a slant of late afternoon light, and starts cutting the next blanket into measured strips. Summer of 1886, and Clara Hensley is standing at the west wall of her cabin with a handful of split pine lath and a box of square-cut nails, doing something nobody in the Judith Basin has ever bothered to do. She's building a wall inside a wall. Here's the method. She takes each lath, split thin, maybe 3/4 of an inch, and nails it vertically to the interior face of the log wall, spaced about 16 inches apart. Every lath sits exactly 2 inches off the logs. That gap matters. Dead air, still air trapped in a narrow space is one of the best insulators you can find. Better than wood, better than stone, better than anything short of wool itself. Clara knows this because she tested it. She held her palm flat against the log wall in January, and then held it 2 inches away and felt the difference. She wrote the observation in her notebook with a date beside it. Now the wool. She takes those blankets, the ones Dale Crandall saw drying on the fence rail, the ones that made him announce to his ranch hand that the widow had lost her mind, and she lays them flat on her table. The brass-handled seam ripper comes out of her apron pocket. She sets a straight edge across the fabric and cuts strips exactly 14 inches wide. Not 13, not 15, 14, because that's the distance between lath centers minus the wood itself, which means each strip fits snug without bunching. And this is the part that matters. She packs the wool strips between the lath and the outer log wall, firm but not compressed. The narrator needs you to understand why. Wool insulates because of the air trapped between its fibers. Crush it flat, and you squeeze that air out. Now it's just a thin layer of wettable fabric pressed against cold wood. Useless. Clara packs it the way you'd pack a pillow, full enough to hold its shape, loose enough to breathe. She works the west wall first. That's the wall facing the prevailing wind, the one that takes the brunt of every storm rolling down from the Rockies. 4 days of cutting, nailing, packing. Her hands are raw by the second evening. The loose strands of dark chestnut hair around her face are stuck to her skin with sweat. That small cluster of freckles across the bridge of her nose disappears under a layer of pine dust. On the 5th day, a man rides up. Emmett Shaw, traveling farrier. Sandy blonde hair pushed back under a flat-crowned, dark gray felt hat. A faint birthmark like a smudge on his right jaw near the earlobe, and a short-handled, brass-headed tack hammer hooked through the leather tool belt slung low across one hip. He's come to shoe Clara's one horse, a stocky bay that's been throwing its left rear shoe every 3 weeks. He does the job quietly, trims the hoof, shapes the shoe on the portable anvil he carries in his pack, drives the nails, clinches them over. Takes about 40 minutes. But when he's done, he doesn't leave. He stands by the fence rail where the wool strips are drying in the sun, tilts his head the way he does when something catches his attention, and looks at the stacked lath leaning by the cabin door. One question. That's all he asks. How are you keeping the moisture out of the wool? Clara looks at him for a long moment. Those gray-green eyes steady under straight, dark brows. I haven't solved that yet. Emmett nods. He collects his pay, $2 even, tips his hat, and rides east. The tack hammer swings gently against his hip as the horse walks away. She should have listened harder to that question. 2 weeks later, Clara pulls back a section of lath on the west wall to check her work. What she finds stops her cold. The wool closest to the outer logs is damp, not soaked, damp. That heavy, clinging moisture that turns wool from an insulator into a conductor. She presses her hand against the packed strip and feels it. Cold. Wet cold. The kind that moves through fabric and into bone. She checks her notebook. The temperature readings confirm what her hand already told her. The insulated west wall section is reading barely warmer than the completely bare north wall. Weeks of work. 14-inch strips cut with precision. Lath nailed 2 inches off the logs. All of it for nothing. The system has failed. But here's what Clara doesn't do. She doesn't curse it. She doesn't defend it. She pulls the lath section fully open, examines the wool layer by layer, and studies where the moisture is worst. Closest to the outer wall. Always closest to the outer wall. The physics are elegant and merciless. Warm air inside the cabin carries moisture, breath, cooking steam, the water bucket by the stove. That warm, moist air drifts through the wool toward the cold outer logs. When it hits the point where the temperature drops below the dew point, the moisture condenses. Liquid water, right there in the insulation. And wet wool doesn't trap air. Wet wool conducts cold straight through like a wick. She needs something on the warm side, a barrier that stops interior moisture from ever reaching the wool in the first place. 3 days later, Emmett Shaw rides back up the trail. He's not here to shoe a horse. He sets a roll of burlap on her porch without ceremony, without explanation. 40 miles east, a trading post, and he remembered. Clara looks at the burlap, runs her thumb across its weave. Dense enough to slow moisture, cheap enough to cover a wall. That might work as the warm side layer, she says. Emmett nods. The hazel eyes with their amber flecks hold steady on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. That evening, 2 tin cups sit on the stove shelf instead of 1. Ruth Partlow arrives the next morning. White silver hair pinned in a tight, low bun, a cream-knitted shawl over her shoulders, the corner of a battered brown leather notebook visible in her dress pocket. She carries a jar of preserved plums and sets it on the table without asking where it should go. She sits. She watches Clara tear down the failed insulation strip by strip. Ruth says almost nothing. When Emmett's name comes up, just once in passing, she smiles into her cup. Clara pulls the failed first section of wool batting off the wall, holds the damp clump in her hands, and carries it outside. She sets it on the fence rail in the sun to dry, and opens her notebook to write down exactly what went wrong. Emmett Shaw watches from 30 feet away, holding his tack hammer, and says nothing. She didn't waste an hour feeling sorry about it. By the time that damp wool clump had started steaming on the fence rail in the September sun, Clara Hensley was already back inside the cabin, notebook open on the floor beside her, brass-handled seam ripper tucked into her apron pocket where it always lived. Those gray-green eyes scanning the exposed wall like it owed her money. And in a way, it did. Every failed insulation attempt cost heat she didn't have yet, and time she was running out of. Here's what she figured out from the failure. The wool worked. The dead air principle worked. What didn't work was where the moisture went. Warm air from the cabin hit the cold outer wall, condensed, and soaked straight back into the batting because there was nothing between the warm side and the insulation to stop it. Classic vapor problem. The fix wasn't complicated. It just had to be precise. Clara tacked burlap to the inner lath, the warm side facing the room. Small iron tacks, spaced every 3 inches. She overlapped each burlap strip by 2 inches and sealed every seam with a thin bead of rendered tallow she'd worked into the fibers with her thumb until the weave darkened and went slightly stiff. Here's why that matters. Tallow waterproofs the seam without making the burlap brittle. A rigid vapor barrier cracks when the cabin expands and contracts with temperature. A tallow-sealed burlap barrier flexes. It breathes just enough to prevent pooling, but blocks the bulk of the moisture from reaching the insulation behind it. Behind this barrier, she repacked the wool strips. But this time, and this is the part that separated the second attempt from the first, she left a 1-inch air gap between the wool and the outer log wall. 1 inch. That gap gave any condensation that did form a channel to drain downward along the logs, instead of soaking laterally into the batting. Gravity does the work. You don't fight moisture. You give it somewhere to go. Emmett Shaw stepped in to help with the re-chinking of the outer wall, and the man brought something Clara hadn't considered. Her original chinking was mud and grass. Simple, traditional, cracked in 12 days. Emmett pushed his flat-crowned gray hat back on his sandy blonde hair, tilted his head the way he always did when he was thinking, and suggested a frontier formula he'd picked up shoeing horses for a mason in Bozeman. 1 part calciumite powder, 2 parts river sand, a generous handful of chopped horsehair for tensile strength. You mix it wet, apply it in thin layers, and let each layer dry before adding the next. The horsehair is the secret. Same principle as rebar in concrete. The fibers distribute stress across the whole surface, so no single crack can propagate. Clara and Emmett tested it on the west wall first. 3 weeks later, not a single crack. The old chinking failed in 12 days. The new formula held through rain, through 2 hard frosts, through a windstorm that rattled the shutters hard enough to wake Clara from a dead sleep. She recorded every observation. Date, temperature, condition of chinking, moisture level on inner wall, dry. She underlined that word twice. They insulated all 4 walls using the refined method. Total materials: 47 collected blankets cut into strips, 9 yards of burlap, 14 pounds of rendered tallow, 340 iron tacks, and 6 days of labor per wall. The narrator in me wants you to sit with that cost for a second. Approximately $3.40 in purchased materials. Everything else was salvaged, bartered, or gifted. $3.40 to insulate an entire cabin against a Montana winter. Dale Crandall's operation spent more than that on lamp oil in a week. Emmett stayed to help with the north and east walls. He didn't announce he was staying, he just didn't leave. His dusty tan boots were by the door each morning before Clara's were laced. They worked side by side in near silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that's full of something neither person has named yet. Coffee appeared warm on the fence post where Clara took her mid-morning break. She never saw him pour it. Dry gloves materialized on the stove bench exactly where cold hands would reach for them after coming in from the woodpile. One evening, working the east wall in fading amber light, Clara's collar folded under her braid where the fabric had bunched. Emmett reached over and straightened it. His fingers, freckled across the backs of both hands, calloused from years of forge work, lingered against the fabric for half a second, maybe less. Then his hand pulled away and found his tack hammer on his belt like it had never left. Neither of them spoke about it. The burlap got tacked, the tallow got applied, the wall got finished. If you've made it this far into Clara's story, stay with me, because the next visitor to her fence line is the part that still makes my jaw tight. Dale Crandall rode up on a Tuesday, brass pocket watch chain catching the light against his dark brown canvas coat, chin lifted in that military straight posture of a man who's never once doubted his own expertise. He looked through the open cabin door at the finished west wall. The clean burlap face, the sealed seams, the tight chinking around every log, and his pale blue eyes narrowed like he was watching someone stack kindling wrong. "All you're doing is trapping damp inside that wall," he said, loud enough for Clara to hear from 20 feet away, loud enough for Emmett to hear from the north side. "Come February, you'll have rot and you'll have nothing." A man who burns 14 cords of wood every winter, telling a woman who's budgeted for 8 that she's the one doing it wrong. That's Dale Crandall, confident, experienced, and so certain that the old way is the only way that he can't see the new data standing right in front of him with sealed seams and a dry interior wall. Clara didn't argue, didn't defend. She opened her notebook, wrote his prediction in the margin, trapped damp, rot by February, dated it October 2nd, 1886, and closed the cover. October 1886. The insulation is complete on all 4 walls, and Clara begins her controlled testing before winter arrives. She doesn't celebrate. She doesn't stand back and admire. She pulls the small brass-handled seam ripper from her apron pocket, tucks it away, and opens the notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she writes the date. Below it, 4 timestamps: 6 in the morning, noon, 6 in the evening, midnight. Beside each one, a blank line for interior temperature. Below that, a line for the exterior reading taken from the thermometer she's nailed to the north fence post at shoulder height, where no reflected heat from the cabin can reach it. Below that, firewood consumed in armloads. Below that, moisture, yes or no, on each wall's inner burlap surface. Below that, wind direction and estimated speed. She writes this template once and copies it every single day for the rest of the season. Now look, I know that sounds tedious. I know it sounds like bookkeeping. But here's the thing. Those little pencil marks on ruled paper are the difference between surviving a killing winter and guessing your way through one. Clara isn't building a cabin. She's building an argument. And an argument needs evidence. The first real test comes late October. A cold snap drops through the valley like a hammer. Overnight low, 9 degrees. Clara rises at 6 in the morning, breath fogging in the dark, stove banked to gray coals, and reads the interior thermometer by candlelight. 34 degrees. She writes it down. Then she pulls on her heavy canvas apron and steps outside to the north post. 9 degrees, exactly. She writes that down too. Here's what matters. The previous year, at the same exterior temperature, the cabin interior dropped to 11 degrees. 11. That's below freezing by 21 degrees. Water in a cup beside the bed would have a skin of ice by morning. This year, at the same cold, she's holding 34. 23 degrees warmer inside than out. The insulation is working. Clara notes the result without a single word of celebration. Instead, she walks every wall, running her fingers across the inner burlap, pressing her palm flat, feeling for damp. East wall, dry. South wall, dry. West wall, dry. North wall. And there it is. A patch of moisture where 2 burlap strips meet, right at the seam, about chest height. Not dripping, not soaked, just damp enough to darken the cloth under her fingertips. She doesn't panic. She heats tallow in a tin cup on the stove, works it into the seam with her thumb, presses the fabric flat, and lets it cool. 30 minutes of work. She notes it in the margin. North wall seam, damp, resealed with tallow, October 27. The system is not perfect. It is being corrected. Dale Crandall's prediction about trapped moisture sits on the opposite page, dated and quoted. He wasn't entirely wrong. He just assumed finding the problem meant the whole thing was doomed. That's the difference between a man who quits at the first crack and a woman who fills it. Now let me tell you about Jasper. Jasper is a mule, dark brown, long-eared, 14 hands, and absolutely certain he does not like Clara Hensley. He was James's mule. James bought him in Bozeman for $22, and for 6 years, Jasper carried tools and fence posts and accepted sugar from James's palm and nobody else's. When James died, Jasper turned his hindquarters toward anyone who walked near his pen, including Clara. Especially Clara. She didn't force it. All through the building season, she worked near his pen, stacking posts, mixing mortar, stretching burlap, and Jasper watched from the far corner with those dark, cautious eyes. By September, he'd moved to the middle of the pen. By October, he stood at the fence rail. She'd hear him shift his weight and snort softly while she measured and cut. By the first week of November, she held out a dried apple on her open palm and waited. Jasper walked forward, dropped his nose, and took it. His lips were warm and rough against her skin, and Clara's gray-green eyes held steady on his, and she didn't move until he finished chewing. His trust is the first proof that the work is sound and the person belongs. Mid-November, Emmett Shaw finishes the last of 3 horses on the neighboring spread and packs his farrier tools into the worn leather belt slung low across his hip. He's leaving for a 6-week circuit through the Yellowstone Valley. Winter work, shoes and pulls and resets at ranches that can't wait until spring. He walks to Clara's porch in the gray morning light, sandy blonde hair pushed back beneath that flat-crowned, dark gray felt hat. He sets his short-handled, brass-headed tack hammer on her porch rail, tilts his head the way he does when he's listening, even though nobody's talking, touches the brim, and says, "I'll be back before the worst of it." Clara nods. That's all. He walks. She watches him go, the faint birthmark on his right jaw near the earlobe, catching the low sun for just a moment before he turns the corner past the barn. Inside, she picks up his tin cup from beside the stove. She does not put it in the wash bucket. She sets it on the shelf behind the stovepipe, where it will stay warm and out of the way, and exactly where she can reach it when he comes back. November deepens. The ledger tells the story in numbers starker than any sentence I could write. Exterior lows, 9, then -4, then -11 over 3 weeks. Interior lows at dawn, 38, 36, 34, 33. The cabin is losing ground, but slowly, so much more slowly than before. Clara studies the entries, traces the decline with her fingertip, and identifies the weak point. The door. A single plank door, no insulation, iron hinges conducting cold straight through. A thermal bridge bleeding heat every hour of every night. She begins building a second inner door, a wool-stuffed frame set 8 inches inside the first, creating a dead-air pocket between them, a primitive airlock. If you've made it this far into Clara's story, stay with me, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Clara closes the notebook on November's final entry. Average interior temperature 41 degrees at dawn. Stove consumption down to 5 armloads per day. And looks out through the frosted window at a sky the color of iron. Her mule, Jasper, has turned his back to the northwest and will not face into the wind. Something is coming. December 14th, 1886. The killing storm arrives. And I'm not going to dress this up for you. I'm going to give you the numbers, because the numbers are the story. Barometric pressure drops like a stone thrown off a cliff. Temperature falls 34 degrees in 4 hours. By nightfall, it sits at 29 degrees below zero. Wind gusting to 62 miles per hour. Visibility less than 10 feet. Snow doesn't fall. Snow moves sideways, a white wall of ice crystals driven so hard they sting like sand thrown from a shovel. And Jasper, that stubborn, brilliant mule, he turned his back to the northwest 6 hours before the first flake fell. He refused to graze since noon, just stood there, ears flat, hindquarters pointed into whatever was coming, and would not move. Clara watched him from the frosted window. She didn't argue with the mule. She never had. By the time the wind shifts from west to full northwest, and the sky goes from iron to something closer to the inside of a closed fist, Jasper is already inside the lean-to shelter Clara built against the south wall of the cabin. Dry straw beneath him, wool batting packed between the boards. The opening faces southeast, away from the wind, exactly as she designed it. He stands calm in there, chewing hay, while the world outside tries to tear itself apart. Now here's what matters. Clara's system under maximum stress. She tracks everything by lantern light, that battered notebook open on the table beside the stove, the brass-handled seam ripper tucked into her canvas apron pocket, where it always sits. Interior temperature at the start of the storm, 38 degrees. She feeds the stove steadily, not frantically, steadily. 5 armloads of wood in the first 12 hours, exactly the rate her November tests predicted. The wool-insulated walls hold. She runs her hand along the burlap vapor barrier at the northeast corner, the spot that gave her trouble back in October, and it's dry. No moisture. The new chinking, the batch mixed with more animal hair and less clay after the first attempt cracked overnight, does not crack. Not a single seam. The double door keeps the wind from cutting through. That 6-inch dead air gap between the inner and outer panels does exactly what it was built to do. Breaks the pressure, kills the draft, turns a 62-mile-per-hour gust into nothing by the time it reaches the room. Interior temperature stabilizes at 33 degrees with the stove burning. 33 degrees. In 29 below. She writes it down. Of course she does. Now let's talk about Dale Crandall. Crandall's main barn, uninsulated, conventional construction. Built the way he's always built, because he's always built it that way, and don't you dare tell him different. Loses 2 sections of roof sheeting to the wind before midnight. Just peels them back like paper. His cattle crowd into whatever shelter remains, packed so tight they're standing on each other. His cabin, chinked with that same old mud and grass mixture he swore by. The mixture he told Clara was good enough for his father and good enough for him. Drops to 14 degrees inside by midnight. 14. That's below freezing, inside a house, with a fire burning. He goes through his entire reserve of firewood by dawn. Every last stick. And 3 of his cattle don't survive the night. The man who stood in Clara's yard with his brass pocket watch catching the light and told her she was wasting her time, that all her fussing with angles and measurements was a woman playing at a man's work. That man is sitting in a 14-degree cabin burning furniture by morning. He survives, but his certainty doesn't. 40 miles south, Emmett Shaw is caught on the trail. The narrator owes you one line about him, and here it is. He's sheltering in a trading post with 4 other men, watching the storm through a cracked window. His flat-crowned gray hat pushed back on his sandy hair, thinking about a brass seam ripper and 2 tin cups sitting side by side on a stove he hasn't seen in weeks. That's all you get right now. Stay with me. Back at the cabin, 1 a.m. The trough runs dry. Clara notices because the sound changes. The faint trickle she's been hearing all night from the pipe. The buried line running from her spring to the cabin goes silent. She knows immediately. That rock shelf, the section where the pipe runs 18 inches below the surface instead of the planned 4 feet 8 inches. She flagged it in the ledger back in October. She tested it, worried about it, noted the risk in her own handwriting. And now the cold has found it, the way cold always finds the weak point, the way winter doesn't care about your effort or your character or how hard you worked. It just finds the gap. If you've made it this far into Clara's story, stay with me, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She doesn't panic. She pulls on her heavy canvas coat, wraps wool scraps around the exposed coupling, and carries warm water from the stove kettle through the inner door, through the outer door, into 29 below zero, and pours it over the frozen section. Then again. Then again. The ice releases. Water moves. She wraps the section with 3 more layers of wool, packs it with straw, covers the straw with a board weighted down with stones, fixes the cold bridge. At midnight, alone, in the worst storm in decades. The system survives not because it was perfect, but because every flaw was found early and corrected before the blizzard could exploit it. She comes back inside, closes both doors, writes the time and the fix in the notebook. Her gray-green eyes are steady in the lantern light. Those freckles across the bridge of her nose, dusted with ice crystals she hasn't bothered to wipe away. At 2 a.m., Clara hears something hitting her outer door that is not wind. A rhythm to it, desperate but deliberate. She opens the inner door, then the outer door, and finds a man and a woman standing in the snow, ice in their hair, holding each other upright. The Prestons. Henry and Margaret Preston, lost on the trail between Bozeman and their homestead 22 miles east. They have been walking in the storm for 3 hours. They expected to die. The woman says one word, "Please." Clara pulls them inside and closes both doors. Clara pulled Henry and Margaret Preston into the cabin, closed both doors, and the Prestons stood in the center of the room, staring at the walls, the warmth, the stove, the 33-degree air that felt like salvation after 29 below. Henry Preston touched the inner wall. His fingers pressed flat against it. He held them there for 3 full seconds. Then he pulled his hand back and looked at it like it had lied to him. "It's warm," he said. 4 feet away, Margaret sat down on the bench near the stove and put her face in her hands and cried. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the sound of someone whose body had been clenched for hours, finally letting go. Clara set 2 cups of coffee on the bench beside her and said nothing. She draped a dry blanket over Margaret's shoulders. She hung their frozen coats near the stove, where the radiant heat would pull the ice out slow without cracking the leather. Henry kept touching the wall. He pressed his palm to it again. He knocked on it. He leaned close and looked at the seams. How is this cabin warm? Clara picked up the battered notebook from the shelf beside the stove. She opened it to the temperature log and handed it to him. Interior readings every 4 hours. Firewood consumed per night. Exterior readings from the thermometer nailed to the north-facing post. She didn't explain. She didn't defend. The numbers spoke. Henry read 3 pages in silence. Margaret drank her coffee and stopped shaking. Outside, the wind screamed against a wall it could not breach. Morning came white and still, the kind of stillness that follows a storm so violent Even the air seems exhausted. Clara stepped outside at first light and read the exterior thermometer. -22. She stepped back inside. Interior, 31 degrees. The stove had burned 5 armloads through the night, not 7. The trough behind the barn was flowing again. That buried line, 4 feet 8 inches down, fed by the thermal mass of the earth and insulated by 12 inches of packed straw, had not frozen once. The double door held, both layers sealed. The wool panels along every wall were bone dry. The burlap vapor barrier behind them showed no condensation. The chinking, the second batch, the one with more animal hair and less clay, had not cracked. Everything built was measured against the worst weather in 14 years. And everything held. If you've made it this far into Clara's story, stay with me. Because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. 2 days after the storm broke, a horse appeared on the south ridge. Dale Crandall rode down slow, his dark brown canvas ranch coat dusted with frost, that brass pocket watch catching weak winter sun against his chest. His chin was still lifted. His posture was still military straight. But something behind those pale blue eyes had shifted. He'd lost 3 head. His barn roof had torn at the northwest corner, where the wind hit the vertical wall and found every weakness he'd ignored. His firewood reserve was gone, burned through in 2 days because his cabin bled heat through single walls and unsealed chinking that he'd dismissed as good enough for 30 years. He did not apologize. He did not mention the time he told the valley Clara was strange for burying wool inside her walls. He did not bring up the afternoon he stood in her doorway and said a woman alone with blankets and notebooks was wasting everyone's concern. He asked one question. How did you keep the moisture off the wool? Clara walked him through it. The burlap vapor barrier hung a ½ inch off the inner wall surface, tallow sealed at every seam with rendered fat pressed into the fiber overlap. Behind the burlap, a 1-inch drainage gap, just air, nothing else, that let any condensation slide down to a shallow channel cut into the base log, draining outward through a tiny notch in the sill. The wool never touched the outer wall. The moisture never touched the wool. Dale Crandall listened without interrupting. He didn't write anything down, but his eyes tracked every seam Clara pointed to, and his jaw worked like he was chewing each detail into memory. He nodded once when she finished. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode north toward his own broken ranch. This is the redemption, not forgiveness, not an apology no one asked for. Knowledge passing from the person who was mocked to the person who mocked them. Emmett Shaw returned in January. He rode through cleared snow on a borrowed mare, his flat-crowned gray hat dusted white, the brass-headed tack hammer swinging at his hip. He found 2 tin cups already sitting on Clara's stove. He set the hammer back on her tool shelf like it had never left. Clara stood near the doorway, that loose chestnut braid over one shoulder, the small brass-handled seam ripper visible in her apron pocket, gray-green eyes steady. She said one word, "Stay." Emmett tilted his head the way he always did when listening. Yes. The narrator does not need to elaborate. You already know what that cost them both. A territorial inspector named Whalen passed through in March. He measured Clara's interior temperature at 48 degrees, while the exterior read 29 below. He checked the walls. He examined every chinking seam. He read the notebook cover to cover. He wrote an efficiency certificate for the land office. Most thermally efficient homestead cabin he had inspected in Montana Territory. Clara nodded and offered him coffee. Years folded after that, the way they do when the work is steady and the ground holds. The cabin grew from 1 room to 3. Emmett's hands built the additions from timber they milled together on a jig he designed, and she improved. 4 homesteads in the valley copied Clara's insulation system, including Dale Crandall's bunkhouse. Ruth Partlow's battered brown notebook still sat on the porch rail beside a chair no one else used, its corner visible even in rain. Jasper's foal grazed the south pasture in long golden light. Clara's dark chestnut hair had gone silver at the temples. Emmett's sandy blonde had faded to white. Their hands were weathered from decades of shared labor. Fence posts and calving and storms survived side by side until the work became the love, and neither could name the moment it changed. Clara held a cup in both hands. Emmett held her other hand without looking at it. The wall is still standing. The wool is still dry. She never did stop collecting blankets, and the cabin never went cold again.